Hello and welcome to the next episode of Serial Killers. Today we'll be finishing up Volume 1 of the PowerPoint franchise with the biography on Andrew Cunanan, who had a victim count of 5. I am your narrator, Porter Hymas, and let's get on with it. Andrew Philip Cunanan was born on August 31st, 1969, in National City, California, to Modesto or Pete Cunanan, who was a Filipino-American, and Mary Ann Shilansi, an Italian-American. Andrew was the youngest of 4 children. Modesto or Pete, as he was more well-knownly called, was in the Navy in Milan, and he lived in the Philippines. He was also a very hard worker, and he really wanted to make a big name for himself, while Andrew's mother, Mary Ann, had mental issues and was very dependent and needed constant support and attention. She was also emotionally frail and a devoted Catholic. When Andrew was born, Mary Ann had to be hospitalized for 3 months, so Pete had to be the primary caregiver for Andrew, and of course, because of that, Pete and Andrew developed a very tight-knit bond. After Andrew was born, Pete left the military and became a stockbroker. Pete also had an explosive temper and strict disciplinarian, but there are no signs or evidence of any direct physical or sexual abuse. However, it is important to note that Andrew's other siblings have all attempted suicide and have had substance abuse, hinting at least some emotional or psychological abuse. During their marriage, Pete began to believe that Mary Ann was unfaithful to him and started to resent her, and the marriage became a very unhappy one. And they really only stayed together for their children. Mary Ann and Pete praised Andrew as he was their favorite son, and they would constantly praise him and spoil him with very expensive gifts. He would like clothing that was very expensive. And eventually they would move into a new house in California. Let me see if I can find out what it was. I think it was Burbank. It was near San Diego. Anywho, it doesn't much matter. They moved into a new house, and Andrew was given the master bedroom and was even given a brand new sports car when Andrew was only 14 years old. Mary Ann was very possessive of Andrew and would often keep him inside from playing with other children. And as a result, Andrew spent most of his time reading books, encyclopedias. He even memorized the Bible and had the tested IQ of 147. So here's a photo with Andrew with his family. Andrew's the one Andrew is right here. And then here's the family photo during Christmas. I believe Andrew is this one here. Oh, wait. Oh, excuse me. I think Andrew is this one. And the other one was his older brother. Andrew received an expensive education and attended a school known as Bishop's School, which was a very high-end private school. In school, Andrew really did like to be noticed. He would wear very expensive clothes and the suits that Pete had bought for him. Um, he even entered a gifted students program due to his highly tested IQ, and he would often tell very elaborate stories, which were, of course, lies, to his classmates about being wealthy and privileged, even though he was not. And he also enjoyed portraying himself as a very sophisticated person. Um, he would often use whatever he had read from in the books to create his stories. Um, At one point, he even would have Mary Ann deliver freshly made meals to Andrew at school during lunch, including lobster, even though they can't afford all of these gifts. Uh, Andrew behaved very polite, intelligent, and bright, and all of his teachers praised him. He got an A in AP Art History and, ironically, for a serial killer, an A in Philosophical Ethics. When Andrew developed sexual feelings for boys, Andrew began to distance himself from Marianne and his school life, and vice versa. He would have none of his classmates come over, and he was secretly keeping his sexual orientation a secret at home, yet he was openly gay at school. During Andrew's senior year, he was voted most likely to be remembered in his yearbook with a quote, I'm not sure how to say this, a pas de luz, which means after me the flood. You can see his yearbook photo at the bottom with his shirt off. This one. The same month that Andrew graduated, Pete lost his job and fell into very deep debt from supplying Andrew's luxury gifts and moving into a very expensive townhome. And if it was Burbank, like I think it was, that's a very wealthy neighborhood. Um, and so, even though he can't afford all this stuff, he's continuing to buy these expensive items. He could never keep a job for more than 2 years and was accused of embezzling from his clients as a stockbroker and fled to the Philippines, taking all the family's earnings and selling the townhome they lived in. Andrew had to drop out of college along with his sister because of this. Andrew visited his father in the Philippines shortly afterwards, but only stayed for a few days, complaining about the humid climate and the poor living conditions of his father. Andrew was now determined to avoid a poor lifestyle. So here's some pictures of him in high school. So when Pete left, Andrew had to fend for himself financially after being spoiled for his entire life. But he did not want to work for money, and he also didn't want to go to school, or at least he didn't want to pay for school. Andrew was forced to get small jobs such as being a drugstore clerk, but lived with his friends from Bishop, who was named Lizzie, and her husband Phil in Berkeley, California. Andrew occasionally babysat her children. Andrew denied his sexuality to Lindsay, but Andrew frequently went to gay bars and spent the night partying, where Andrew continued to tell stories and gave a very rich persona, fearing rejection and wanting to find a meaningful relationship. He would often brag about meeting the famous fashion designer Gianni Versace, and even said one time that Versace invited Andrew to the opera. He was When Versace was in town, which was in San Francisco. Um, to design costumes in 1990 and traveled with Versace to Italy a lot. Parts of this may be true with the whole because Versace was in San Francisco near where Andrew was living and often would go. In 1990 for um, the opera Capriccio. So that part may be true, but it is also very possible that this should just be a story Andrew's fabricated. Hard to say. He also said that his father was a rich pineapple plantation owner in the Philippines. He often introduced himself as Andrew de Silva instead of Andrew Cunanan because it sounded more elegant and sophisticated than his real last name. Andrew would go around asking people for money to help him pay for his education that Andrew desperately wanted, but instead of going to school, he used the money for parties and to show off, often giving his friends gifts. Um, Eventually, Andrew had to move back in with Mary Ann, and Andrew would stay out most nights and even days at a time partying while Mary Ann cleaned, cooked, and other things for Andrew, completely for Andrew, as she continues to be very clingy to Andrew. Um, Andrew wanted Mary Ann to leave him alone most of the time, however, although he also still wanted her to be kind of like her butler, or his butler or servant. Um, there was one incident in 1993 when Andrew got mad at his mother and threw her at a wall, fracturing her shoulder. In late 1992 or early 1993, Andrew Cunanan met a man named Jeff Trail, who was in the Navy, where he struggled with keeping his sexuality, as he was gay as well, a secret, and even went on an interview about being gay in the military, but he eventually left the military for multitude of reasons. Part of it was because of his sexuality, also because was an incident and he wasn't doing very well at the academy. But anywho, Andrew and Jeff developed a close non-sexual bond as friends. Although Andrew clinged to Jeff and would try to impress him by saying he was in the Israeli army. In order to support Andrew's expensive lifestyle and to keep up the appearance he was giving, Andrew began to deal crystal meth and even use it himself, as crystal meth was a common drug in the San Diego community, especially in the San Diego gay community. As Andrew used the crystal meth, Andrew's brain chemistry began to change because of drug addictions and all that stuff. And drove Andrew into depression and he would develop an irritable temper from the drug side effects. Andrew also became into hard porn and S&M sex and bondage type stuff in order to raise his status in the gay community. These two things would soon consume Andrew as he cultivated violent sexual fantasies. Andrew may have also made money as a callboy and sexual escort, flying to meet wealthy clients. This may be how he met his third victim, Lee Migland, which we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to his actual murder. Under his sexual services, Andrew began to look for someone to keep him as a live-in escort, and he wanted to find a sugar daddy. Andrew wanted someone rich to support his luxurious lifestyle that he wanted. And in the mid 1994, Andrew met a wealthy man named Norman Blatchford, or Ford. Can see him with some of his friends. This is one of the apartments Andrew would stay at. I think this is also where he lived with his mother. So Norman Blatchford was a very rich man who sold his film special effects company in order to get his wealth. When Andrew first met Norman, Andrew talked about a very wide variety of topics in order to seem charming. He would mainly talk about art, and he also introduced himself as Andrew De Silva instead of Andrew Cunanan. Um, Andrew moved in with Norman as a live-in escort and also interior designer in July 1995. Hey, sorry, that was the cat. Andrew was able to live out his luxurious fantasy of a wealthy life with Norman, and Norman gave Andrew a monthly allowance, um, while Andrew acted as Norman's decorator. However, Andrew constantly pushed Norman for more money to buy things or for Norman to buy expensive furniture and do renovations that Norman wasn't comfortable with buying. Norman was very kind of like calculated with spending his money, and Andrew was kind of just like the type that burns a hole in your pocket. Um, yes, Norman wanted to be very smart with his money, but Andrew complained when Norman refused about his request by calling Norman cheap. Norman and Andrew often attended operas and parties and galas, etc., and other rich events. And Andrew injected himself in practically any conversation, no matter what the topic was. Andrew's intelligence charmed Norman, and he wanted Andrew to further his education in order to get a good career, so Andrew could put his knowledge to good use and not waste it. Norman even offered that to pay for college for Andrew, but Andrew didn't want to work for money, and he became greedy and lazy. In November 1995, while Andrew was staying in an expensive hotel in San Francisco, I think it was the Oriental Hotel or the Mandarin Hotel or something like that. It was a very luxurious hotel, is all you really need to know, and it was in San Francisco. Andrew saw a young blonde man named David Madison at the bar or at the bar's hotel, and Andrew found the man handsome, as blonde was his type, and he sent David Madison a drink. David Madison was a talented architect from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and was staying in San Francisco at the time on business. David was a very kind person who didn't like violence, as when his father took him out hunting as a boy and they killed a duck, he was very distraught and cried, and just violence wasn't his thing. And he was very popular. He was very kind to people. David was everything Andrew wanted. He was talented and successful and wealthy and handsome. And that night, the two stayed in Andrew's hotel room, but they didn't engage in any sexual stuff. Um, the relationship began, but it was long distance. Andrew didn't have David communicate to him, but Andrew would communicate with David, and also David had to mail letters to Andrew to a P.O. box and an actual address. Andrew would often send David postcards. Andrew also wanted to do things David didn't want to do, and David wasn't very attracted to Andrew. The relationship eventually developed a lot of strife, but Andrew was deeply in love with David, almost to the point of delusion. So there's David Madsen and Andrew, like David, Andrew, right there. Even though their relationship was developing a lot of tension, Andrew still wanted to impress David and told his usual stories and lies and would buy David expensive gifts such as a gold wallet. Soon, however, David was starting to become annoyed about their relationship and Andrew's passive aggressive controlling behavior with the letters and the mailing and the lies, etc. And also because Andrew had to cancel plans because of Norman, and Andrew didn't tell David about Norman, so he was being very secretive with that part, with both of them because Norman also didn't know about David. In fact, Norman was starting to think that Andrew secretly had a wife and child that he was visiting when really it was just David. So Andrew and David broke up in July 1965. Simultaneously, during a trip to France with Norman in the summer of 1996. Oops, did I say 1969? Oops. In 1996, Andrew and Norman had a falling out after Norman refused to buy Andrew a new Mercedes. After Andrew failed in order to convince Norman to get the car, in a very grand gesture, Andrew packed up everything and left the house, thinking that Norman would eventually give in and have Andrew come back. However, he did not. And so when Andrew demanded the Mercedes, first-class air travel, and an increase in pay, Norman was only willing to increase his pay, but Andrew refused and moved out. Breaking up with David and being cut off from Norman were very major blows to Andrew, as at first he had his fantasy of a rich lifestyle, which was now over, and his dream relationship was also now over. Andrew turned to his best friend Jeff Trail for support, but Jeff was also getting fed up with Andrew's stories and theatrics, especially when Andrew asked Jeff to lie for him, as Jeff was a very honest person and didn't like lying at all. Andrew's drug use also escalated after the breakup, as well as Andrew's obsession with violent porn and S&M bondage, etc. And he also started to gain weight. He fell into depression, low self-esteem, and started to have dramatic mood swings and aggressive temper. Andrew spent most of his time at bars, staying all day or even night, and burned through whatever money Andrew was able to get from his drug dealing. There's some more photos. In late October 1996, Jeff found a job at a propane company in Minneapolis, coincidentally, the same city where David Madsen lived. And Andrew used this as an opportunity in order to win David back. However, David was already seeing someone new by the time Jeff moved to Minneapolis, and Andrew began acting out, pulling stunts, and being rude. One time, he even lit a paper plate on fire during a party and just walked away. Jeff and David soon became friends, but there was no signs of any relationship, just friends. And Jeff warned David about how Andrew was a pathological liar. Andrew often stayed in Minneapolis with Jeff over the next few months, and even though David and Jeff were getting fed up with Andrew's behavior, they were still very supportive to Andrew. They kind of had this sense ooh, we should help him. They felt like they owed that much to him, and they didn't want to outright tell him that they didn't want to be around him anymore. They're just hoping he'll pick up the signs, but Andrew's not wanting that at all. So, Andrew continued to try and win David back with expensive gifts and appealing to his nature and even a need to help people, which was a very strong characteristic of David. Afterwards, Andrew constantly visited Minneapolis on several occasions, but was using a lot of credit cards to buy tickets for the airplanes, causing Andrew to fall into very serious debt. Similar to what his father had, what happened with his father, Pete. Andrew was also able to purchase a one-way ticket to Minneapolis, and before he left, However, despite him having serious debt with maxed out credit cards, Andrew was able to purchase a one-way ticket to Minneapolis. Andrew gave away some of his possessions before he left, and even called Norman Blatchford to say goodbye. Andrew boarded the Northwest Airlines flight 5 76, scheduled to arrive in Minneapolis at 5:20 p.m., where David picked him up at the airport with a backpack with pornographic material, steroids, and a gun with bullets. Jeff and David still didn't want Andrew around, but they didn't want to outright tell him and simply hinted at it. Andrew again stayed with Jeff at his apartment. Then, during Andrew's stay on Sunday, April 27th, 1997, Andrew returned to David's loft and left a message on Jeff's phone machine saying that he would like to see Jeff. Jeff arrived at David's loft around 9:45 p.m., and Andrew struck Jeff with a claw hammer 27 times in the head and wrist as he lifted his wrist up to defend himself, causing his watch to stop at 9:55, which later helped the police identify the time of death. There was even brain matter smashed into the door frame itself. Then Andrew moved the body away from the door, rolled it up into a rug, and set it against the sofa in the living room because it's a loft, so it's a very open space. So it's basically right in view because there's the couch, there's where he left the body, and then there's the kitchen. The body was discovered by the building's manager when checking on David a few days later on Thursday after he didn't show up for work the past few days. Police first thought that the body was David's and only identified Jeff once the autopsy was done and then suspected David of being the murderer. Jeff Trail was killed when he was only 28 years old. There's some more photos of Jeff Trail in his military outfit. There's his gravestone. There's the rug where the body was found, rolled up in. Here's a bloody shoe print they found in the loft. This is the name tag on Andrew's duffel bag that he brought with him. There's David Manson's bedroom. That's David's shoe. The rug again. The blood splatter from the door area. I believe those are the box of bullets that were found in the duffel bag. Some of the handcuffs and pornographic material that they found in Andrew's duffel bag. Another scene of the door. So after the murder of Jeff Trail, several witnesses say that they saw what is believed to be David and Andrew walking David's dog, who is named Prince. Hey, Ripley. Hey. Excuse me, the cat was getting into something that she wasn't supposed to. Andrew took David's Jeep and drove north. David spent a few days with Andrew, for which is unknown. About 5 days after Jeff Trail's murder. What happened in that time frame is largely unknown, but most likely Andrew threatened and manipulated and obviously in shock David, as David did not like violence, so he was probably very, very passive and in shock and very easy to probably like holding David hostage. But because later Andrew would not be captured alive, this is probably we'll never find out what actually happened. But on May 3rd, 1997, David's body was found by fishermen on the east shore of Rush Lake in Chisago, Minnesota, with 3 gunshot wounds, one to the head and 2 to the back, from a gun Andrew had stole from Jeff's apartment, and bullets taken from Andrew's duffel bag that he had packed for the trip. It is believed that David died between April 29th and May 2nd. David was only 33 years old. Now, it's actually interesting because when trying to find out David's time of death, it was tricky since he was found by a lake and it's Minnesota and the climate changes, so he was kind of in bad decomp. But some of the ways they were able to find out the time of death, and sometimes they did this, sometimes they don't, but they actually measured the potassium levels in the David's eyeballs, and if they're higher, that usually means longer time of death. And another thing that they could have done but didn't was David's body had maggots found on him, and so they could have tested the age of the maggots and how long they were in their life cycle. But that's just an interesting thing. Here's some crime scenes of where he was found by the lake. Another photo of David Madsen. And there's his grave with the... Before we move on to the next murder victim, I kind of want to touch up. After David's murder, the Minneapolis police were kind of getting some friction from the Trail family and the Madsen family. At first, they thought David was an accomplice with the crimes, and the lead detective, who was named Detective Titchich, which is kind of fun to say, was very known for being kind of like having a very bad relationship with the victims' families. And so that kind of caused some issues. On May 3rd, 1997, Andrew had driven all the way up to Chicago. Lee Miglin was a prominent real estate tycoon in Chicago. And was married to his wife named Marilyn Miglin. On May 4th, Marilyn Miglin arrived from the airport around 8:15 a.m. She was on a business trip as she was a perfume saleswoman on television on those like infomercial stuff, and called over and Lee was supposed to pick her up, but he never arrived, so she had to get home from like a taxi. And then she called over to the neighbors, who were the buyers, to come over saying that something was wrong. Marilyn was concerned that Lee didn't pick her up from the airport like he was supposed to, and the group inspected the house. In the kitchen, there was a half-eaten, melted pint of ice cream with a spoon stuck in it, as well as an empty Coke can in the sink. This was incredibly unusual, as Lee was a very neat, clean freak and was very meticulous about the way he kept his house. They also found a gun in the upstairs bathroom, and dark hair shavings in the sink, and soap scum in the tub. There was also a ham with a knife stuck into it on Lee's desk. By this time, they knew something wrong had happened and were expecting to find someone, either a drug addict or a burglar, in the house or Lee's body, and so they decided to call the police. Upon further investigation, $2,000 was missing, along with 2 leather jackets, a couple of suits, ladies' jewelry, and a pair of very nice black socks. Upon inspecting the garage, Lee's green Lexus was found missing, and eventually Lee's body was found under one of the other cars in the garage, with the blood being covered up by brown paper wrapping. The body was clothed and had a shoe on and had one shoe missing, and was also found gay pornographic magazines nearby, and his pants zipper was ripped open, but there was no signs of sexual molestation. Another thing, Lee's clothing wasn't very bloody, and given the way he was killed, it was most likely that he was redressed or undressed and redressed or given a new pair of clothing. But we don't really know what happened in the time span of his murder. Lee had been bound at his feet with an extension cord and his face wrapped with masking tape with holes in the nostrils in order to resemble a latex mask often used in S&M and bondage sex. He was stabbed more than 20 times with a screwdriver, which was later found in Lee's stolen Lexus, and had his throat cut open with a hacksaw, which nearly decapitated his head. His mouth was gagged. There were 24 blows to the head, causing lacerations. 2 bags of cement were also thrown onto his chest, which fractured all of his ribs. The body was then covered up with plastic bags and brown paper. No defensive wounds were found. Andrew may have coerced Lee, and since Lee was a passive person, he didn't give much of a resistance to Andrew. David's Jeep, which Andrew drove up to Chicago, was found parked nearby. There are signs that Andrew tortured Lee before killing him, and this was the most brutal crime Andrew would ever commit. And what's unusual is that he stayed in the house after the murder, giving the possibility that Andrew may have known Lee was not alone, or that no one was returning for a while. There were no signs of forced entry. The reason for this is that Lee may have known Andrew because of what we discussed earlier, that he may have been secretly gay and closeted and used Andrew for sexual services. Or Andrew may have persuaded Lee to invite him inside, giving them like a story, like my car broke down, can I use your phone, etc. Something like that. Like he made up a story, which is not uncommon for Andrew to kind of weasel his way in, or he simply forced his way into the house at gunpoint after Lee answered the door. There's really a whole bunch of possibilities, but there is one thing that must be made clear. Although it's a possibility that Lee was possibility, there has been no found evidence that the two ever met before. The time of death is estimated between 2 p.m. Saturday and 6 a.m. Sunday, and Lee Miglin was 72 years old. It is speculated, but undetermined, if Lee was secretly gay, and if Lee was actually closeted, that Andrew may have met Lee as an escort service. But there are many other explanations of how Andrew could have gotten inside without forced entry. However, of course, Andrew did previously claim to have a sugar daddy in Chicago who was in the real estate business. Plus, Lee was the type of person that Andrew envied for his wealthy lifestyle and probably would have read up on him, and he probably would have known him. But there's a whole bunch of unknowns, and it's really just speculation. But yeah, there's Lee Miglin. There's him and his wife. There's his wife crying. I think it might be the funeral. And here's kind of like a snapshot of Marilyn Miglin with her selling her perfume on TV. Here is the ham they found on Lee's desk. There is the garage. You can see the empty spot where the green Lexus would have been. That would have been the car his body would be found under. There was the missing Lexus. So, now that we have went from 2 murders in Minnesota to a third in Chicago, now we're starting to get some issues. Now we have an interstate issue, so we start seeing some interstate department conflict and jurisdictional issues, which slowed the investigation a bit. However, when investigating Lee's death, the police labeled this a random killing and put Andrew on the FBI's most wanted list as the 449th fugitive listed, which boosted the Cunanan case nationwide. And of course, since that happened, the media began covering the story rapidly and was able to receive a large amount of information about the case, as well as so very many rumors, most of which were Andrew's lies, sometimes even treated as reality. One thing though, since the previously two victims were gay, and then we have this Lee Miglin, now all of a sudden they are wanting, in order to have the story really grab headlines, they want to find evidence that Lee Miglin was secretly gay. And they looked a lot. The tabloids were scurrying everywhere for some piece of evidence to say Lee was secretly gay, but they have found nothing at all. Not to say that Lee wasn't gay, but it's really both things are a possibility. Of course, he may have been previously targeted by Andrew because Andrew may have known him from reading about him, as he was a prominent real estate developer, and he was among the people Andrew would have read about. He often would read about his favorite magazine was Vanity Magazine, which he read religiously, and he obsessively read stuff about wealthy men that he found attractive, or just wealthy men in general, like Gianni Versace, even Tom Cruise. Just whatever he get his hands on, he would. So he may have been targeted. He may have just been by chance. It may have just been opportunity. We really don't know, to be honest. There's so very many possibilities. But anywho, the media desperately wanted to find this because that would just really make the story, but they found nothing. Meanwhile, Andrew drove to New York, to the Atlantic coast states, New York, Pennsylvania, and the New Jersey area. That the police were able to find that out because they were able to track the green Lexus from Lee Miglin's house from a software called Triggerfish in order to track, because it's the 1990s. In those days, the cars had cell phones attached in them. And Andrew was close to being apprehended, however, and I just find this absolutely ridiculous and terrible police management and media etiquette, just terrible. A leak was released that told the story of how police were tracking the car from the cell phone. Andrew ditched the car, which was later found with the phone equipment mashed up, the antenna and receiver cut out, but the actual power box that powered the phone and allowed him to track it was still there, so the phone kept transmitting. So he just ditched the car. On May 9th, 1997, at 3:30 p.m., Andrew entered the Finns Point National Cemetery in Pennsville, New Jersey, which was plot land for Civil War soldiers and World War II German prisoners of war. William, or Bill Reese, was the caretaker who very much enjoyed nature and loved his job, and even acted in Civil War reenactments. Andrew shot William Reese while Reese was kneeling down and took Reese's red pickup truck and drove down I-95. Reese's body was discovered around 5 p.m. by his wife and son after getting concerned he hadn't shown up back from work yet. Police found Miglin's Lexus and the trunk full of items from the murder, such as the bloody screwdriver. Also, it was very erratic, and it was a very dirty car. There's a lot of stuff in it. There's William Reese with his son. Here is the wanted poster of the FBI for Andrew. Vans quickly surrounded the crime scene and ran with the story intensely, largely due to the homosexual aspect of the case and the fact that now it's a nationwide case that's happening across multiple states that's unraveling very rapidly because technically Andrew Cunanan is a spree killer. Even saying Andrew killed from a love triangle or from revenge of contracting AIDS, which is ridiculous. The investigation was also flawed and began to slow down because this was after the famous O.J. Simpson trial. And so police departments became very, very careful with their investigations in order to make sure that these cases would hold up in court. Because they wanted to avoid the same embarrassment that happened with the LAPD and O.J. Simpson, which is actually kind of a smart thing to do because you don't want to screw up the evidence, but they're doing it very close by the book, which is very slow. And that does have its flaws, especially in this type of case, which is unraveling so quickly that doing it by the book isn't really able to catch him in time. Plus, they would have caught him if someone didn't leak it to the press. The investigation also got a lot of strife due to the fact that the case involved multiple states at this point. Now that